Good evening, everyone. My name is Taylor Jaworski, and I'm the Associate Faculty Director of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado Boulder. The Benson Center's mission is twofold, is to promote the study of Western civilization and to promote intellectual and ideological diversity on the CU Boulder campus and beyond. So I'm here tonight to introduce our speaker, Joseph or Jody Bottum. I'm going to give just a brief introduction, just to give you guys a little flavor of what Jody has worked on in his career. So his background academically, at least his Ph.D. is in philosophy from Boston College. He has served as the literary editor and the poetry editor and then editor for the Weekly Standard as well as First Things. So very much a man of letters. He's the author of two, not recent, but books. Not all recent. One, The Decline of the Novel, and then a second, I think something that's going to be covered a little bit the topic of today, An Anxious Age, which I think people have described it as prophetic or sort of informative for the times that we live in, but written more than a decade ago. And then I think Jody would want me to mention that one of his newer projects is a Substack on poetry. It's called Poems, Ancient and Modern. And I think that one of the obligations that anyone has is when you hear about a Substack, you immediately have to go and sign up for it. So you should do that. I think he was telling us about it last night at dinner, and it seems quite interesting. But then, to keep the introduction brief, the topic of his talk tonight, The Great Awokening, the Birth of Identity Politics in Spiritual Anxiety. Jody, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I asked if I could give this talk sitting down because I didn't realize how short of breath I was going to be up here. And the altitude is, wow. Let's start this way. It's old news that we live in a highly contentious time, socially, politically, a profoundly divided time, a deeply emotive time. Less well understood, I think, is the reason for it all. There's a tenor, a timbre to American public life that is not sufficiently explained by finance or personal interest or election campaigns or even the common accounts of political theory. Events these days seem to matter in ways incommensurate with their actual impacts and actual costs. Think, for example, of Peanut the squirrel. Now, to some degree, that's always been true, and it always will be true. The use of symbols in any society is impossible to explain completely, except to say that there will always be some play of symbols of greater or lesser distance from reality. For that matter, it's impossible to predict perfectly the peculiar elective affinity of some issues to clump together even though they have no logical connection. To make progress on these topics, we would need a full psychology, a complete philosophical anthropology to understand the human building blocks from which societies and political entities are formed. And here, I suppose, we could go back to Aristotle's account of the great soul and the virtues that feed happiness, joined to his understanding of human beings as both desirous of knowledge and political by nature. Or we could look to Thomas Hobbes' tale of primal fear as the cause for the birth of cities, or we could revisit Rousseau, or Adam Smith's account of personal interest, or Machiavelli. We could, in other words, simply start over, you and I, and reread our way through the entire history of human thought in the hour or so we have tonight. But probably we should take some shortcuts to reach up to the social condition of America over the past decade. For connecting psychology and social interaction, I find particularly useful the thought of my old friend René Girard, with his understanding that much of human desire does not come prepackaged in Freudian shapes, the death wish, the Oedipal complex. Rather, he suggests our desires are formed by watching what others desire. Our desires are, as he would say, mimetic. The psychology of desire, in other words, is at least partly a social phenomenon. And from mimetic desires, we have such fundamental political churnings as escalating rivalry and, central to his thought, scapegoating. But then, in recent days, I've also been thinking about the psychological elements in the social thought of Reinhold Niebuhr, his sense in the mid-20th century in his Christian realism that our social condition is defined by the fact that, created in God's image, we are essentially free, which means that a clash of interests is inevitable. A straightforward social idealism cannot explain just how depraved the motives for human actions can be, and a straightforward realism cannot explain the call to goodness that humans also feel. To understand the social condition, we must balance our sense of idealism and our sense of realism while, and I think this is his key insight, the fact of human freedom means there is no stable solution. Nothing lasts forever. In fact, the great sin of statesmanship is trying to make a final conclusion, trying, as the followers of Eric Voegelin used to say, to immanentize the eschaton, to force the city of man to act as though it were the city of God. Now, these are all intermediate things, connectors of the nature of human beings to their political and social activities. But I want to add one more, which is the spiritual hunger in individuals for which a stable culture or good culture must provide an outlet. Sociology once understood this, even in a sense began with it. From Durkheim's 1897 study, his first book on suicide, down to Weber's 1904 Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and on down to Peter L. Berger's 1967 Sacred Canopy and Digby Baltzell's 1964 The Protestant Establishment, for that matter, which is an important book for some of what we're going to talk about tonight. Somewhere along the way, however, professional and academic sociology essentially gave up on religion, at least in the sense of describing one of those intermediate facts that connect the universals of human nature to the particularities of a given social situation. For academics, my call here tonight is a return to understanding spiritual anxiety as a constant in any society. The thicker the culture, the more unified across its physical and numinous strata, the less it is agitated by this anxiety. Certainly not everybody feels a deep need for a moral and metaphysical horizon, but those who do feel it, they're dangerous, for their very sense of selfhood is bound up with an anxious anger and a belief in their own rectitude. They feel themselves righteous, and they are stern and even violent judges of their culture and of their fellow citizens. I've argued before for what I call the Erie Canal thesis of American history, named for all the threads of American religion that passed through upstate New York in the 1800s. The thesis is essentially this, that the study of any era in American history must begin with describing the state of Protestant religion at that moment in the nation. We cannot understand the revolution of 1776 entirely without some examination of the Great Awakening. The Civil War without the preaching of emancipation, Prohibition without the rise of missionary work, or the Civil Rights Movement without the role of the churches. And the reason is that the old Protestant ascendancy is the institution by which America instantiated in the history of our particular culture the human desire for spiritual assurance. If the Erie Canal thesis holds, then to understand the agitations of the past decade, we have to ask something. We have to ask about the state of Protestant religion. And to answer that, let me start with a story I came across a few years ago, for it seems to me we all know this person. American history is filled with her. her nobility and moral dedication, in her intrusive do-gooderism and dictating the lives of others, in her goodness and her silliness. Think of it this way. Every day she must search her conscience. Every day she must confront her flaws, discern the dark that dwells within her, seek the grace to turn toward the light. Oh, she is a moral person, she believes, good-willed and determined to do good deeds, instructing us all about the heart's deep iniquity. But even she, Katie Radner, a former school teacher now preaching our bondage to sin, even she still feels the fault inside her. Even she must struggle to be saved. And if someone like Katie Radner has to fight the legacy of inner evil, think of all that you must do. Think how far you are from grace when you do not even know yet that you are lost and blind. In another age, Radner might have been a revivalist out on the sawdust circuit, playing the old forthright hymns on a wheezy harmonium as the tent begins to fill. In a different time, she might have been a temperance lecturer, inveighing in her passion-raw voice against the evils of the demon rum. In days gone by, she might have been a missionary to heathen lands, or the author of Bible Society tracts, or the scripture-quoting scourge of civic indifference, railing to the city council members that they are like the people in Revelation, neither hot nor cold, and God will spew them from his mouth. But all such old American Christian might-have-beens are unreal in the present world for someone like Katie Radner. Mockable, for that matter, and many of her fellow activists today identify Christianity with the history of all that they oppose. She wouldn't know a theological doctrine or a biblical quotation if she ran into it headlong. And so Radner fights racism. The deep racism that lurks unnoticed in our thoughts and in our words and in our deeds. The better to gird herself for the struggle, she gave up teaching high school students to attend a Ph.D. program in critical whiteness studies. But even such total immersion is not enough to wash away the stain of inherited sin. I have to every day wake up and acknowledge that I am so deeply embedded with racist thoughts and notions and actions in my body, she testified to a teachers' conference. I have to choose every day to do anti-racist work and think in an anti-racist way. Radner's hardly alone in this feeling. Discussions of the kind of racial privilege that she hates have been much in the news, and the response from any number of commentators is that those who deny the idea of privilege just don't understand what privilege is, just don't grasp the insidious way the shared guilt of racism appears in the form of white privilege, just don't see their own sinfulness. So profound is the sin, in fact, that not even its proponents escape. The more they are aware of white privilege, the more they see it everywhere, even in themselves. There is not a space here to list all the ways in which white privilege plays out, but it is clear that I will carry this privilege with me until the day I die, admitted a University of Texas professor in an essay that has been assigned to Wisconsin high school students. In fact, the occasional incidents of explicit open racism, he said, actually distract us from the real racism that dwells in every American's heart. Some of this, of course, derives from the perception of actual economic and social effects still lingering in the long aftermath of racial slavery and segregation. But taken just as a concept, considered purely in its moral shape, white privilege is something we have seen before, for the idea is structurally identical to the Christian idea of original sin. Indeed, the relation involves more than just a logical parallel, the natural contours of any idea about shared guilt and inherited fault. Historically and genealogically, there is a clear path that leads from original sin, in which the most advanced Americans once commonly believed, to the idea of white privilege that they now assume. In my book, An Anxious Age, a decade ago, I noted that the Protestant churches in early America were widely divided on theological and ecclesial issues, and yet they somehow joined to form what Alexis de Tocqueville would call the nation's undivided current of morals and manners. We can debate how long-lasting and all-encompassing that central Protestantism really was, but many of those churches would eventually coalesce into the denominations of the Protestant mainline, and the collapse in recent decades of the mainline churches, listen to these numbers, from around 50% of the nation in 1965 to well under 10% today, remains one of the most astonishing cultural changes in American history, and nobody has paid enough attention to it. And with that mainline collapse, a set of spiritual concerns once contained and channeled by those churches was set free to find new homes in our public conflicts. We live in a highly spiritual age, spiritualized age, when we believe that our ordinary political opponents are not merely mistaken, but actually evil. We live with religious anxiety when we expect our attitudes towards social questions to explain our goodness and our salvation. The anxiety appears today on too much of both the left and the right, but it's hard to imagine a clearer case of the theological origins of this spiritualizing of secular politics than the perceived guilt of white privilege. From the Puritans to the 19th century, the central current of American culture held a generally Calvinist view of original sin as injuring the whole of human nature. In Adam's fall, we sinned all, as the old New England primer taught generations of American school children. Corrupted with concupiscence and pride, expelled from the garden, we lost the ability to do the good with proper motives. Even if weakened reason were able to discern what the good might be. Early in the 20th century, however, the main denominations of liberal American Protestantism gradually came to a new view of sin, understanding our innate failings as fundamentally social rather than personal. Crystallized by Walter Rauschenbusch's influential Christianity and the Social Crisis in 1907, the social gospel movement saw such sins as militarism and bigotry as the forces that Christ revealed in his preaching, the social forces that crucified him and whose wounds he bore upon his body. And it is against those social forces that he was resurrected. Not that Christ mattered all that much in the social gospel's construal. Theological critics from John Gresham Machen in the 1920s to Reinhold Niebuhr in the 1950s pointed out that the social gospel actually left little for the Redeemer to do. Living after his revelation, what further use do we have of him? This is a metaphor from Wittgenstein, actually. Jesus becomes, in the social gospel construal, like the ladder by which we climb up to the higher ledge of morality. But having reached the higher ledge, what do we need the ladder for anymore? Millions of believing Christians still populate the United States, of course, evangelicals and Catholics and the remaining members of the mainline churches. Demographically, America is still an overwhelmingly Christian nation. But the social gospel's loss of a strong sense of Christ facilitated the drift of the congregants, particularly the elite and college-educated classes, out of the mainline churches that their grandparents attended and that once characterized the nation, out of the churches and into the generally secularized milieu. The point, however, is that they did not leave empty-handed. Born in the Christian churches, the civil rights movement had focused on bigotry as the most pressing social sin of the 50s and 60s, and when the mainline Protestants began to leave their denominations, they carried with them the Christian shape of social and moral ideas, however much they had imagined that they had rejected its Christian content. How else can we understand the religious fervor with which white privilege has been preached this past decade? The spiritual urgency with which its proponents described a universal inherited guilt they must seek out behind even its cleverest masks. Their very sense of themselves as good people, their confidence in their salvation from the original sin of American culture requires all this. In order to believe white privilege, however, in order to feel the universal guilt of it, we must believe in the necessary ground for the idea, a widespread American racism however unrecognized, that is the current form of the same old social sins that gave us slavery and then segregation. In the in the 1988 academic essay that was the origin of the phrase white privilege, a key sign of such privilege is that having mostly erased from themselves the race consciousness necessary for racial slavery and segregation, whites no longer have to recognize race in the way that blacks and other racial minorities still do. One of the privileges of being white is not having to see or deal with racism all the time. As a manual for training the nation's military equal opportunity officers puts it, and thus the manual offers or demands this corrective, commands to military officers, assume racism is everywhere, every day. Without that faith in universal and pervasive guilt, it would be perverse to require post-segregation Americans to recreate in themselves the race consciousness they were taught to congratulate the nation for having left behind. That conservative complaint, however, entirely misses the spiritual shape and the religious logic of white privilege, of, say, the college activists who've been, over the past decade, commanding students to check their privilege. The auto da fe, the self-abnegation with which activists confess their own interior guilt, suggests that the current use of the idea of white privilege has more to do with a religious impulse than it does with the realities of economic or social formation. The path to escaping racial consciousness really does run through increasing racial consciousness, if the idea works the way the idea of original sin does. All have sinned, writes St. Paul in the 5th chapter of his letter to the Christians in Rome, even those who have not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression. And so too, we are all guilty of racism, even those who have never harbored an explicitly racist thought, or said an explicitly racist word, or performed an explicitly racist deed. We have to get away from this idea that there is one sort of racism and it wears a Ku Klux Klan hood, as a Berkeley law professor explained. There are many other forms of racism. There are racisms, plural, under which we all suffer. And just as for Paul in Romans, the law entered that the offense might abound, so our awareness of our own racism massively increases when we realize that we are utterly formed as racists. And just as for Paul, where sin abounded, grace did much more abound, so it is only from this overwhelming awareness of racism that we can hope to escape racism. The doctrine of original sin is probably incoherent and certainly gloomy in the absence of its pairing with the concept of a divine Savior. And so Paul concludes Romans 5 with a turn to the Redeemer and the possibility of hope. As sin hath reigned unto death, even so might grace reign through righteousness unto eternal life by Jesus Christ our Lord. Think of it as a car's engine or transmission scattered in pieces around a junkyard. The individual bits of Christian theology don't actually work very well when they're broken apart from one another. Which is why it probably shouldn't be much of a surprise that an infinite sadness often haunts expressions of the white privilege notion that we must become more aware of race in order to end the inherited sin of being aware of race. If we cannot escape it, then how can we escape it? When Professor Jensen cries out in his chiliastic pain, "I will carry this privilege with me until the day I die," he's speaking in tones once reserved for the moral solution that only the second coming could provide. The strangeness of the isolated concept can be discerned in its unendingness, its never satisfied ratchet. Of course, however Christian the idea of white privilege may have been in origin, it emerged in contemporary America stripped of Christ and his church, making it available even for post and non-Christians. For that matter, an explicit anti-Christianity is often heard alongside rejections of white privilege. As one of Radner's Race Conference fellows said the everyday, pervasive, deep-seated and institutionalized dominance of Christian values, Christian institutions, leaders, and Christians as a group are primarily for the benefit of Christian ruling elites and perpetuate racism. But that, too, is typical of much post-mainline moral discussion in America, the Church of Christ without Christ, as Flannery O'Connor once called it. The mainline congregations may be gone as significant factors in the nation's public life, but their collapse released a religious logic and set of spiritual anxieties that are still with us, still demanding that we see our nation and ourselves in the patterns cast by their old theological light. Take another religious idea that runs wild once it broke from the mainline Protestant churches that defined America. Take the idea of the apocalypse. For an astounding portion of American thinking seems apocalyptic in form. It's almost always the end of days. Now, sociologically, an overwhelming sense of impending Armageddon is a disaster for any society. Society cannot long survive people believing that the end is nigh. But psychologically and ethically, in the moral sense of the self, the idea of the apocalypse is incredibly useful because it cleans up the mess. We allow so many small social lies, minor hypocrisies, tension-easing politenesses. They form the grease that helps the wheels of civilization run, but they are also greasy. They nag at us in conscience. And if the end of days is almost here, then moral thinking is clean again. Politeness is a sin when the destruction of the world looms around us. Hypocrisy is complicity with evil once the four horsemen begin to run. I speak here not of the reality, but merely of the psychological usefulness of the idea. For the idea of the apocalypse is a terrible and wonderful simplifier of the puzzles of human existence. That's what makes it dangerous, and history is full of millennious cults and chiliastic movements that wrecked their eras. One of the very sociologically significant things the mainline churches did in American history was contain and corral that kind of dangerous idea, giving it a place where it could both dwell meaningfully and not ruin the civilization. Those days are gone. Plenty of the spiritualizing of American social politics occurs on the political right, in the libertarian elevation of the idea of individual freedom above all, or in the tendency of trumpeting populists to be excessively confident in their righteousness. One can discern dissociated Christian ideas. It's in the air, and no one escapes from it entirely. But it is mostly on the left that the idea of original sin and the apocalypse have broken free from the old churches to run rampant in the new politics. So for that matter, has the old Christian idea of shunning sinners until they repent. Twitter and cancel cultures seem to have been invented for the sole purpose of recreating the practice of shunning here now in the Church of Christ without Christ. In Democracy in America, as I mentioned, Tocqueville identified the central current of America in its manners and morals. However much the rival sects that he saw when he visited America feuded against one another, they joined in this central current. And it is the mainline Protestant churches which provided America with those morals and manners. Mainline, as an aside, mainline is a term that's created later, but we can apply it retroactively in in a loose sense. The mainline churches helped define American culture in several ways. First of all, those churches were mostly apolitical, which had a profound effect on American culture. For instance, there's never been a truly great American political novel. The average French streetwalker or prostitute in a novel by Zola knows more about politics than the heroes of the greatest American novels. What is it to be an American? At the highest artistic level, it is to be concerned not with politics, but with the cosmos and the self. Politics is incidental to Moby Dick and the Scarlet Letter and Huckleberry Finn. And that's because mainline Protestantism rendered politics secondary to what it deemed most important, salvation and the self. Second, mainline Protestantism defined the structure of the family and the shape of everyday life. Baptisms and marriages and funerals. It effectively shaped the social life of communities. When Tocqueville talks about those non-governmental associations in America that he found so fascinating, two examples he gives are volunteer fire departments and mutual burial societies. These people banding together to make sure that there were mourners at each one of their funerals in these new American towns. This Protestantism will also shape the idea of the nuclear family, provide a sense of the arc of life, and frame how we understand what's driving our behavior and how we think about politics. The third thing Protestantism gave us was a shared rhetoric in the language of the Bible. When Adlai Stevenson, the former Democratic governor of Illinois, was asked why he decided to run for president for a second time in 1956, he answered, "It was not like Saul on the road to Damascus." There was a cultural assumption that people would get this sort of biblical reference. You all know, I mean, how lost is that reference? You guys know, right? That it's what happens to Saul who becomes Paul on the road to Damascus. And this sort of biblical reference, this rhetoric, this shared rhetoric, gave a unity to American culture. As much as the Lutherans were not the same as the Methodists and so on, the churches shared what Tocqueville called the central stream, the main current in American life. But in the 1970s, the old mainline Protestantism started to break down. A question of what might replace its centrality in American culture emerges. And there's a period in the 1990s and early 2000s when it seemed that Catholicism might provide the moral language that mainline Protestantism no longer did. In the event, for many reasons, that project failed. Because liberal Protestantism did not disappear. It just shifted into post-Protestantism. There's an extraordinary point here. Walter Rauschenbusch, the key figure in the social gospel movement, lists 6 species of social sin in 1907. If you go through that list, they are exactly what radicals have been objecting to over the past decade. Bigotry, the ignorance of the uneducated, power, corruption, militarism, and oppression. It lines up perfectly with more recent agitation. What we're seeing now is an amplification, an intense spiritual hunger that has no outlet. Just to take events over the last decade, there's no way to see people kneeling or singing hands up, don't shoot, or swaying while they hold candles, or listening to them label their political opponents with the most extreme terms and avoid acknowledging that it's driven by a spiritual desire. I first perceived this some years ago when a magazine assigned me to write about Occupy Wall Street. And I went down and interviewed the people, and I could feel this, what Max Weber had described as spiritual anxiety in them. It's become even more like this. It's an intense spiritual hunger that is manifesting itself because to these post-Protestants, the world is an outrage and we are all sinners. We have a pair of words in English derived from fanum, the Latin word for temple. We get the word profane from it, for those who stand in front, outside the temple. And we get the word fanatic from it as well, for those who never leave the temple, refusing to soil themselves by touching outsiders. That's what shunning is looking for. If you profane, if you're outside the temple, the only way back is to become fanatic, to convince people that you understand how guilty you are. We live in the strangest times, but understanding the historical roots as post-Protestant and understanding the spiritual outlet, which has no outlet, helps explain where we are. This is what happens when you have a mainline outlook that is broken loose from all its prior constraints. These ideas used to be corralled in the churches, and if you let an idea like original sin, which is a dangerous and powerful idea, loose from its corral, it goes to the place where it can exist, which is politics. The line I used to use, if you believe your ordinary political opponents are not merely mistaken, but are evil, you have ceased to do politics and begun to do religion. Ross Douthat, in a column in the New York Times, said that one of the things we need to take from that work I did a decade ago is the distinction between the elite and the elect. I chose the term elect because the people who are part of it are not elite in the sense of having $100 billion. They are not elite in the sense of being political figures. They are not elite in the sense that they control things. So we need another term for them. They certainly have elite educations, but that elite education is not translated into the enormous wealth and power that the true elite have. I could have gone with a class analysis here and talked about Milovan Djilas's analysis in The New Class, which is a fundamental book from the 1950s. There's also the managerial class analysis that has dominated American sociology for many years and is still really informative. But I wanted to push this in a different direction. Suppose you analyze this class in terms of its members' answer to the question, how do you know that you are saved? In the past, that same class would have answered, because I believe in Jesus Christ, and all the rest of it. But the modern version of this question is, how do you know you are a good person? How can you have assurance of your goodness? Which is Max Weber's question in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And Weber says that anxiety about salvation actually has economic and political consequences. So let's apply that Weberian analysis and ask, what are the consequences of being worried about your salvation? Phrased in today's terms, of being worried about being a good person. If it's all about social ills, then you know that you are a good person if you are opposed to those social ills, if you are anti-racist, even if you don't do anything. You are convinced of your own salvation. You are one of the elect if you adopt this stance of being opposed to the great sins. Now, what we've seen over the past decade is that younger people are less willing to put up with the hypocrisy of knowing you are a good person but not actually doing anything about it. And there's can become violent out of this. Members of the elect are much more economically and socially insecure than the elite, but they have the same education, they have the same social markers, and in some ways we are seeing an intra-class warfare between the elect and the elite. What's extraordinary is that the young members of the elect seem to kind of be winning against the old elite. This is the only way I could explain what happened in 2020 when young staffers at the New York Times forced James Bennett, the editorial page editor, to resign. And that's incredible. Every old newspaper editor I knew in the generations before mine when I was young would have looked at a letter signed by hundreds of junior staffers criticizing an editorial decision and said, I'm sorry that you're quitting. Mm-hmm. The younger generation, when they see old power figures tremble, start thinking, why aren't we in the positions of power? Then class elements, elitism start to creep back in, but the original impulse came from seeing leaders like college presidents being hypocrites. They were just mouthing what they thought was the latest line of the old liberal consensus. What they didn't fully intuit is that the old liberal consensus was completely gone and the new line had become something much more radical. If today you were to put forward any of the shibboleths of high liberalism of the 1950s, you would be immediately denounced as a terrible reactionary conservative. Race is the problem we have never solved in this country. After the Reconstruction era and the aftermath of the Civil War, we lost the national will for solving it. Segregation was evil, second only to slavery, and the Great Society welfare state of the 1960s has manifestly proved a failure. But what I object to is the idea that deep feeling is going to solve what these three other forms of dealing with race failed to, or that absurdly utopian ideas like abolishing the police will solve the problem. We don't live in a utopia, and those ideas prove to cause only more problems. The elect have not been called upon to be responsible. Their members are still simply objecting, and they are objecting for reasons that are at least half and probably more emotional, which is to say, objecting in order to feel good about themselves. All it does is create more unhappiness in the name of your self-righteousness. This is what I have called the self-love of self-hatred. It's, I'm such a sinner, and art I wonderful for knowing that I'm a sinner. And that deep feeling is what defines the Church of Christ without Christ. It's a way of saying you either have this feeling or you don't. And if you don't, you're evil. And if you do, you're good. Christian theology and Christian spiritual practice has dealt with this for millennia. This is the distinction Calvin would have made between justification and sanctification. The idea here is that we no longer need to argue it because any argument of it is engaging with people beyond the pale. They are outside the church. They are the profane. They're just wrong. And what are they wrong about? They are wrong in the central feeling of moral goodness. Another way to put this is to see that we are living in the age of the ad hominem. The fundamental way to answer a claim is to say something about the person who said it. Whether it's a tu quoque or an abusive ad hominem or poisoning the well, these are all species of ad hominem arguments. The ad hominem is a whole genus of fallacy. How do we know that they are wrong? They are wrong because some bad people have said it too. It's not about the content of what is said, it's about the people who said it. It's not enough to be one of the good guys, to be on the right side. You have to be constantly abject. You have to agree with your condemners or your evil. Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher, to my mind, actually, the best philosophical mind of the existentialists. I think he was better as a philosopher than Jean-Paul Sartre. But he wrote a book about the Moscow show trials called Humanism and Terror in the 1930s. And he pointed out the ways in which the psychological process by which people can come to confess their own guilt about something, come actually to believe in their guilt, even though they know at some level that they're not guilty of the thing that they are accused of. But this mode of permanent contrition is best understood, I think, not in its psychology, but it's in its religious modes. This is what you get when the old mainline Protestant concerns enter the public square, enter politics, divorced from and freed from their old constraints. The world is full of Christian ideas gone mad. And that's intelligible only if we understand that we live not in an atheistic age, but in a post-Protestant age. Our politics are even more religious than they were in the First Great Awakening in the 1730s. We have trouble recognizing the impulse as religious because American history taught us to associate the religious with the Protestant churches, the central current of manners and morals. But even if we have left these churches, they have shaped our understandings and our expectations. We still attend the Church of Christ. We just strip the Christianity out of it. Thank you. I've got one frown over here.
No, not a frown. Not a frown about the talk.
That was great.
Yeah, so let's open it up for questions. I think there can be Zoom questions that will appear before me here. But we'll start it out with, right here. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I enjoyed your talk a lot. The idea that wokeism, or the successor ideology, call it what you will, has a component of religious fervor to it, is a familiar one, but I like the way that you put it in terms of spiritual anxiety. Here's sort of a very simple question, though. You locate this spiritual anxiety within Christianity, but isn't it true that, say, Reform and even many conservative forms of Judaism have similarly become the Church of Christ without Christianity, but in this case minus the Christ too?
Yeah.
So I wonder how essentially Christian is this?
Well, part of it is class in America. Now, I'm convinced that old senses of class, the upper class and the middle class and the lower class, are no longer a useful metric for analyzing contemporary America. I think it's much more about money than it used to be. American class has always been about money, but I think there were elements you could identify of genteel poverty and so on, that I think are no longer true. And it's less, so that the old sense of class is a less useful device for analyzing American culture than it used to be. But part of this is class. Compared to this, the strivers, the middle class aiming to move up to the upper middle class or even the upper class, would leave the Baptist congregations of their childhood to join the Episcopalians. There was a way in which you would move into this new church. I think much the same thing is going on. I mean, we could talk about post-synagogue Jews and praying Muslims. We could talk about other classes here, but this is a Protestant nation. It always has been. Look, Jews and Catholics were welcomed here off and on, but the central Mississippi that ran through the middle of this nation was Protestant. And so at every point it's going to define kind of the culture. This is my Erie Canal thesis. And it seems to me that this post-Protestantism is a rather lovely form of this old Protestant ascendancy, in that you don't even have to have been Christian to join it. You can be a post-synagogue Jew. Now, remember also that Reform Judaism is an American phenomenon. It was invented in Cincinnati. And one of the old jokes is, why is there basically no Reform Judaism in Israel? And the Jewish joke about it is because the Israelis want the synagogue they don't go to be Orthodox. So that there is a sort of way in which Reform Judaism was already an attempt to identify kind of Judaism that could be put into parallel with the mainline Protestant churches, this kind of religious ascendancy. And so you had Will Herberg's, what was that book, 1964, Protestant Catholic Jew, as a kind of, look, aren't we all really the same? One of the classic statements of that. In a way, he was Jewish. It was incredible chutzpah. Jews at that point were, 3% of the population? The Protestants were well over 50%. The Catholics were about 30%. The Jews were like 3%. And he puts them all as sort of, oh, look, we're all equal, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, we're all saying the same thing. But Reform Judaism already was an attempt to kind of identify an American form that would just fit along this Protestant line. And among the post-Protestants, you don't even have to have started out as a Christian. You just have to kind of join the mainstream in the way that, as I opened this, in the way that the strivers would once leave their Methodist upbringings to become kind of general Christianists and go to church at the Episcopalian churches, which were the churches of the upper class.
So, brief follow-up?
Yeah.
So is it fair to say that then that in your view, original sin is an idea that we sort of breathe, as Americans have breathed in from the air?
So anybody can have these ideas, right? And different religions have had them at different times. I'm not arguing that this is somehow a uniquely Christian idea, or its present form is. But ideas happen in particular cultural ways, in particular cultural places. And in America, that means it's Christian. And more specifically, that means it's Protestant. Right? That's the milieu into which this idea of original sin explodes across the nation. And I made two claims about white privilege in this context. One is that it has the spiritual shape, the same logic as the idea of original sin. And then it could just be, not related except to have the same shape. But then the second claim was historically and genealogically, as Nietzsche would use the term, it descends from that. It is part of the same understanding of America that Tocqueville had, this idea that there is a central current of morals and manners. It's just very dangerously, it broke loose from the churches. Churches used to protect us from people who believed in the apocalypse, for instance, you know? It was a place for that dangerous energy to go. Right? Once it's set loose, we have, you know, I was listening to, for my sins, I was up late last night listening to the election returns and some of the reactions to the election returns. And one I heard at least 4 or 5 times is, well, now the planet's going to die. Right? That's an apocalyptic view. But it's the apocalypse let loose from that crazy congregant in your Baptist church who wanted to talk to you, or a Pentecostalism, who wanted to talk to you about what's actually going on in Revelations book 7. It broke loose from those guys, and it's now a kind of mainstream idea in politics. And politics is, I think we have a healthier culture when these ideas have some corral around them, some outlet for themselves in their, that isn't public life. You think of it this way, when you, in the third idea I mentioned, which was shunning, right, is a Christian idea that broke free from Christianity. You know, you keep people out of the temple until they've repented, right? That's the idea of shunning from the congregation. Well, what's the temple? Once the idea is broken, these ideas have broken loose, the temple becomes public life itself. They have to be banished from public life. They have to be shunned. Not just from, you know, you can't come and take communion, right? But from the whole of public life, because that's the temple in which these ideas have found their new life.
Yeah, right here.
So I have one question that's sort of a follow-up and then more independent thought. So is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. So to start with kind of the follow-up, I was sort of interested, you're emphasizing this idea of being post-Protestant because you're looking at the US context. But it does seem like we have similar trends going on across Europe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like heavily post-Catholic nations, right? So France, we have similar trends. Nations which weren't predominantly Protestant in the way that the US has been historically. Do you think there's some degree to which your analysis can just be applied to post-Christian nations as a whole? Or is there something distinctive about the way that Protestantism is playing out in the United States as opposed to what we see in, I guess, other contexts?
It's a really good question, right? Is there kind of post-Catholic thing here? Now, remember, Northern Europe was all Protestant, right? So this is England, Germany, Scandinavia. Northern France, too. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
the Huguenots didn't come from nowhere. But do we really see this in Paris, in Spain, in Italy, you know, the Southern Europeans? I don't know. I will say, I've always wondered why a few years ago, suddenly the French became interested in my work. And I had an interview in Paris Match, I had an interview in L'Express. I actually had set up a whole lecture series in France, which disappeared in COVID. COVID broke and suddenly, but I was like, I want someone to pay for me to go to Europe, can I? But no, it turned out COVID shut it all down. And I wondered why, and I finally asked Laure, the woman who interviewed me for Paris Match, why? And she said, well, what we're really hoping is that this is a Protestant phenomenon so that we in France we can congratulate ourselves for not having it. And I thought, good luck to you. You know, I don't know. But I do think that there are certain inoculations that might help in these Catholic countries. One of which is simply this idea that the Catholicism has always been a more political religion, not in the sense of, you know, direct politics, although, you know, there was a time in which the Archbishop of the Chancery in the Archdiocese of New York was called the powerhouse in New York politics. You know, so there was some direct politics, but I just mean in kind of Catholic cultures, there was a better integration of political life and the churchly life. Now, you know, lots of American thinkers would congratulate us on not having that. But remember, I started with this claim that early on that there's never been a great American political novel. You know, I mean, if you look at a list of political novels, it's like Advise and Consent, which is a potboiler. All the King's Men is a good novel, but it's not actually about national politics. It's not even really political. It's a personal study of Huey Long. But generally speaking, the great American works of art are not about politics because, you know, what's real, what's important? It's the self and the self-salvation and the cosmos. That's what we want. You know, when the fundamental American novel is The Scarlet Letter, or Hemingway would say Huckleberry Finn, or Moby Dick, right? I mean, Moby Dick is about a vast metaphor for the hunt for God and the loss of the soul and the cosmos that's indifferent and yet evil and yet also godly. It ain't got anything to do with politics. And we've always had that kind of distinction. I will confess that personally, I'd like to go back to it. I would love to live in a world in which politics didn't matter all that much. But we don't, right? And one of the reasons we don't is that these ideas that used to be corralled in the churches, which in an American context means the mainline Protestant churches, broke free from those churches like wild horses getting out of the corral. And they went to where they could live, which was politics.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like Catholic social teaching, definitely there's like a lot of that stuff. And then, yeah, novels on that. And then my question kind of independently was, I was thinking about, okay, you brought up like mainline denominations, right? And this like massive decline in attendance, right, across like Episcopal, Presbyterian, right, Methodist, like these mainline organizations. And I'm kind of curious, there does seem to be something interesting to the fact that once the churches reached a certain point of being a social gospel, right, it seems like then people just sort of left the church entirely. Do you think there's something to the fact that once you kind of get this like post-Christian Protestantism, the Protestantism itself becomes seemingly unnecessary, and maybe that's part of the decline? Is there a sense in which part of the reason people are leaving mainline denominations is in part because the things which were distinctive about denominations and Protestantism are no longer, right, like contained within them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think it was predetermined, maybe over-determined, that it would move this way in the social gospel movement, or that the social gospel movement defeats itself by being victorious. And I think the answer really is, as Machen would have said in the 1920s, which is where he actually coins the term fundamentalist to describe his biblical inerrancy and the other elements of the kind of Protestantism he and the Philadelphia Seminary put forward. But I think that metaphor that I borrowed from an entirely different context, from Wittgenstein, about the ladder, is incredibly useful for understanding it. Because every one of those social gospel people was a deeply and profoundly biblically educated Christian. But they formed a set of preachings in their genuine and deserved outrage at the industrial condition of America. It was the Triangle Shirt Fire that radicalized Rauschenbusch. He'd come out of Rochester and gone to a parish in New York, and it was, the social condition in Hell's Kitchen that just made him outraged. And so he fed this. An aside, the philosopher Richard Rorty, the previous chancellor, is Rauschenbusch's grandson. So Rauschenbusch is the leader of this, has genuine social concerns. They seem to be entirely deserved. But he preaches a kind of gospel in which, for the people he's preaching to, who've been listening to the Bible preached their whole lives, for them, they can hear this and they'll still know. But their children won't. And their grandchildren will stop going to church, because why do you need to go to church? You're a good person if you've got this social definition of goodness in mind. Rauschenbusch, who was a really interesting rhetorician, I've always liked his prose, calls it the ganglion chain of redeemed individuals. so that we're redeemed by knowing that we oppose these, and we form a kind of ganglion chain that's going to change society. Notice in that description, there's no word of church. Right? The church, in fact, is replaced by, the idea of the church is replaced by this ganglion chain, and also the idea of denominations. What separates a Baptist from a Methodist? Or Presbyterian, for that matter. These just become tags of no theological difference. The old denominations, Tocqueville looks at them and thinks, Tocqueville actually, in Tocqueville's time, one of the best estimates by some really good historians, Nathan Hatch and others, is that there were somewhere around 137 different denominations of Baptists. Wow. And the time that Tocqueville visits, and it's two seats in the Spirit Baptist, and it's the Green River Baptist, and the list goes on and on and on. Well, Tocqueville is going to look at that and he thinks they hate each other. They're defining themselves by all kinds of really strongly held theological distinctions about revelation and the rapture and church organization, whether you have bishops or not, real presence in the Eucharist. Where the Episcopalians are going to have some feeling for it, and the Lutherans a little bit of feeling for it, and then you reach down the line until you get no feeling for it at all. So there are all kinds of distinctions there, but yet somehow they all worked together, even though they fought each other. Well, by the time you reach the 1970s, it's not clear that there's any strong theological reason to be a Presbyterian instead of a Methodist. What's the difference? Well, the Methodist Church is closer. That becomes the difference. The mainline churches all start to blend together in the name of the social gospel, and of course, they lose this idea of Christ. Christ is still proclaimed this great moral teacher, but once we've got the lesson, we don't need him anymore. We've climbed up the ladder to the ladder that is Christ, up to the new level of morality, and then we don't need Christ. Then the next generation, we don't need to go to church, right? And then the mainline denominations collapse.
Yeah, thank you. This was a lot of fun. I'll stick to one question. So you seem to be suggesting that up until maybe the decline of the mainline Protestant churches, starting 50 or so years ago, they had been doing a decent job of corralling in keeping kind of politics subordinate to religion. And I'm wondering, I'm broadly sympathetic to your story, and there's a part of me that wants to say you're on the right track and you just need to go even further. I was thinking about the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Sure.
By Julia Ward Howe.
With that last verse about,
let us die to make men free.
As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free.
And the grapes of wrath are referenced in the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and that's a revelation.
The other way around.
He's trampling the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. And so you're getting some apocalyptic imagery from Revelation. You're getting this intermingling of politics and religion. And Julia Ward Howe is a Unitarian, and you might think of Unitarians as basically post-Protestants, or just kind of almost there, just not quite there.
The old joke of my generation, or my parents' generation, would be, why don't you want to get a Unitarian mad at you? Because they'll burn a giant question mark on your lawn. So already, you're right. The Unitarians were making a kind of post-Christian move.
Right. But Unitarianism goes back, 200 years or so. And,
sure.
And so what do you think about this proposal? The Great Awakening happened, over 200 years ago, and the Puritan churches in particular have never done a great job of corralling or separating religion and politics. The horse was out of the barn, already by the 19th century. So it's kind of, we agree with the kind of general Bottum thesis. We're just extrapolating it back even further in time?
Okay, and I'd say no.
Okay.
I would say Christianity has always tempted us to surmount Christianity, right? To say we've won, we've got this new morality. We talked about this at a roundtable earlier today, where Nietzsche complained about the English who thought they were going to be able to keep Christian ethics while rejecting Christian claims about reality, Christian metaphysics. So that Christianity, I think, has always had this kind of temptation to say, even the Gnostics, right? Go back to Marcion, that early.
Sure.
There's this kind of temptation in Christianity to say, let's get rid of this intractable physical Christ event stuff, right? And it's Judaism and the rest of it. I mean, when Marcion redefines, who's the Gnostic Christian and very early Gnostic Christian, he redefines the gospel or the Testament as nothing from the Old Testament, the Gospel of Mark, and one of Paul's letters, and that's going to be the Bible. Because everything else has got this bodily Christ stuff in it, or Jewish stuff, worse yet, that we just don't want. We want to rise above it. So I'd say there's a way in which Christianity always kind of tempts us to rise above the bodily and the physical and the historically instanced. I will say, yeah, the Unitarians, sure, early on, or earlier anyway, and there are a lot of, I was going to say nutball, but that's maybe a little too strong. There are a lot of alternative Christianities that appear in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I called it the Erie Canal thesis is because every one of them appeared in upstate New York.
Yep.
This is where the Millerites appear, who are going to become the Seventh-day Adventists. This is where the Mormons come from. This is where the revival circuit is going to begin. Part of it was called the Burnt-Over District, because so many revivals had happened there that there were no souls left to save. The fields had been burnt over. And that's all upstate New York. As I mentioned earlier, when American studies started to emerge in the 40s and 50s as an academic department in American colleges, Perry Miller, that was the name I was trying to come up with. Perry Miller is one of the key figures in this. They're all going to trace American history back to the Puritans. But I think, in fact, that Baltzell and others, what's his name, who wrote Albion Seed?
David Hackett.
Right. That they're right, that in fact there were several lines of foundational Christianities in the New Republic, or in pre-Republic in the colonies. The place where you want to see all the threads gathered into one ring, they come out of different lines and they all get fed through one ring, upstate New York in the 19th century. Not Puritan Boston in the 17th century, but upstate New York in the 19th century. Everything passes through upstate New York, and most of it through Rochester. Right? Rochester is like ground zero for every strange idea about Christianity. But so there was a lot of this, and the Millerites were very apocalyptic. I mean, not quite as apocalyptic as the Pentecostals would be in the 20th century, who started in Los Angeles, actually, in the Azusa Street revivals. But you're going to get a lot of strange Christianities, and the country's always been able to kind of accommodate them, to outlast them. Right? Why? Because we had a main line that would kind of keep things stable. Now, if we're going to be apocalyptic in a mainline way, Civil War is the time when you're going to do it, right? It looks pretty apocalyptic. But even there you get, the abolitionist preaching and so on. Plus you get a kind of self-congratulation in the North afterwards among that class for this. This is Henry Miller, or not Henry Miller, this is the novel The Bostonians by Henry James, right? Where a Southerner shows up in Boston in that highly woman-dominated, self-congratulatory, we were right about slavery world, right? And it's like a cat among the pigeons, these feminine principles that all, this sudden masculine principle introduced into that world causes endless havoc. It's comedy that Henry James is writing there. But he does capture something of that kind of prissy self-congratulation that came from it. That, I think, is the Unitarian impulse brought back into the fold of a kind of mainline feeling. So, yeah, there have always been outliers. There's always been nutballs. There's always been a weird Christianity in the history of America. We're speaking in broad strokes of what caused and created the central current of manners and morals in the nation. And the answer is, it's these churches all working together. I see it this way. America got all the benefits of having a state church, and there are real benefits in theopolitics to having a state church. America, with this kind of unified but diverse mainline Protestantism, got all the benefits of having a state church with none of the disadvantages. Because it didn't have to be government supported in the way, it didn't have to put down its rivals. We got all the, there are real dangers to having a state church too. And America somehow weirdly threaded this needle, threaded this narrow path to have the equivalent of a state church without it being a state church. And that is the central current of manners and morals that these churches, these rival and sometimes very antagonistic churches, somehow joined to create.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I thought that was very thoughtful. So I was wondering whether you thought that there is a connection between what you call spiritual anxiety and any sort of moral anxiety. And if so, what the connection might be. So I was kind of thinking while you were talking that there seems to be some kind of easy way out of the anxiety about being a good person that people are kind of finding, that has to do with, the self-congratulation, what you call the self-love and the self-hatred, where you're confessing to this, kind of sin that you kind of don't really believe you have. It's also sort of an easier thing to confess. It's not like something, about your character. It's not envy or schadenfreude or something that would actually be really difficult to confess. That might require, some soul searching, and it might be painful. There's also this diffusion of responsibility. You're just born that way. I mean, that's just the easiest thing to confess, right? You basically know you didn't have control over that characteristic. And so I was kind of wondering whether you think that maybe sort of stoking this, what you call spiritual anxiety and finding that way out might not be a way of shielding yourself from actual moral anxiety, where you have to really ask a question about yourself. No, am I a good person? Forget about other white people or other whatever. Just think about me. What are my particular, character flaws and so on. And if I can just somehow assure myself that I'm a good person on that other basis and take that easy way out, maybe that would just kind of protect me from having to do some real self-examination.
No, I think that's quite right. I just don't make the same distinction, or I don't really understand the distinction between a spiritual anxiety and a moral anxiety. I think the question, if you ask yourself, what is the good, or am I a good person, the very concept of good is a numinous idea. You're already moving out. I would relate this to narcissism and the therapeutic culture, the things that Christopher Lasch, who was another great sociologist whom I haven't mentioned, Rochester, New York, too, of course, because everything goes through Rochester. But Kit Lasch was somebody who would look at some of the phenomena you're describing, the therapeutic, which is actually a way of making you feel good about yourself without changing. And so I think that's right. But the idea of the good itself, the very thing, am I a good person, is asking a metaphysical question. It's asking about your status as a being. And it causes anxiety, whether, because it's already numinous, how do you have assurance? It wasn't the question of salvation that motivated the Dutch and the English and the Germans, the people that Max Weber studies in the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It isn't exactly salvation that worries them, it's assurance about salvation that causes them this endless anxiety. And so they start saving because they can't spend their money in any moral way that they understand, and then capitalism begins. I mean, it's an impish idea that Weber puts. He basically says, how Marx says Protestantism happens because of economic changes, right? We have this new wealth emerging. They weren't quite ready to get rid of their Christianity, but they were willing to get rid of thrown in altar Catholicism. And so we have economic causes for the Protestant Reformation. And Max Weber, who's an heir of this in the intellectual community, says, no, you know what? Stand it on its head. The Protestant Reformation caused capitalism, rather than the other way around. It's a very impish thing for him to have done. But I think you're right about all these elements of this and how we lost some capacity, for real self-reflection and so on, in the loss of confession, in the loss of, the thing about those Protestant churches is, even if it's the same sort of class of people who have left them behind, in those old churches, at least, every so often you had to hear a sermon about sin and your own sinfulness. And now you don't, there's some loss of public rhetoric, there's some loss of calls to personal holiness that have been taken away. Now, look, none of these people are mine. I mean, I'm a Catholic. This isn't my people. But they formed America in ways that it strikes me are very, very interesting here. And I would say, to ask that question, how am I a good person, is already to be involved in philosophical concepts of the self, the numinous order, things beyond the self. And so, the moral question is of spiritual anxiety.
Yeah, so this is very good. Yeah, so what I was thinking that, it's possible that, when people, have what you call spiritual anxiety, they're thinking of themselves as, having some kind of immortal soul that could be saved maybe in some way, and maybe the salvation can somehow be guaranteed. And that is very different from normal moral anxiety, where that, there is nothing guaranteed. You can do something wrong every day, any day, the good thing that you did yesterday, you might end up undoing it because now in frustration you say something unkind, and now this good thing that you did yesterday, so there are no guarantees in moral life in the same way. There is basically there's not an equivalent.
Well, there's no guarantees in the life of the spirit either. But I will say this, there's another line that one might take to connect this, which is to pick up Pascal's description of a God-shaped hole in the soul, right? That there's some want in us. Where did Pascal? Oh, you're going to teach Pascal in the spring.
Maybe.
But there's something, and I think this is quite right. Although I don't know how one would sell it. But there is something in us that will not be satisfied. Would be yet another of those pieces that tries to connect human psychology to social conditions. There's something in us that will not be satisfied without the divine.
So we're going to have at least 2 questions, so I want to get to those. So yeah, go ahead in the back there.
Hi. So this might just be more of an observation, but the idea of this church without Christ, it brought to mind Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov when Ivan gives the story about the Grand Inquisitor, the Second Coming, right? So more so maybe the question is there some sort of methodological similarity between what you're talking about in this post-Protestantism, or more so just maybe a state thing?
Remember when the old priest dies in the Brothers Karamazov? And his body is preserved, and people are saying, oh, it's a miracle, and then it begins to decay very rapidly, and they say, oh, he must be a terrible sinner, right? If you actually line up the chronologies, this is a very literary reading of that book, which of course is typically read not for its literary constructions, but for its philosophical and theological claims. If you actually line up the chronologies, the moment he starts to decay, and so rapidly, is also the moment that the youngest brother comes to terms with and begins to accept his spiritual mission. And Dostoevsky is giving us this sense that the spirit that the old brother had, right, that the priest had, has left him and gone to the younger brother. That's the moment he's actually going to turn his vague Christian ideas into Christian practice, because the spirit has left the dead body and entered him. Now, as I say, that's a very literary reading of a book that's often in American courses not taught in a literary way. The Grand Inquisitor story is a story about Christianity gone wrong, of course, that comes to terms with the state church, it's the Catholics, of course, and it's the Jesuits, worst of all, who are being blamed for this, right, in the Brothers Karamazov. But it's of a Christianity kind of gone wrong that uses itself to control things by completely ignoring the apocalyptic, the spiritual, the radical claims of Christianity, right? Perhaps one of the hardest things in the New Testament is when Christ says, "I'm come to bring fire. I've come not to bring peace, but the sword. I've come to bring fire on earth, and what do I care if it is already burning?" And that's an extraordinary claim, right? And the Catholic Church, as instance in these Jesuits in the Grand Inquisitor story, has sort of carefully pushed all that aside, and we have a system of control. And yeah, can Christianity go wrong that way? Absolutely. But the thing is, America kind of escaped that. This is my view of American exceptionalism. America escaped that by having a state church that wasn't really a state church. Right? So we didn't have that kind of political control. But somehow we got the benefits of a central current of manners and morals. We got the benefit of a state church without kind of that denial of Christianity or brutal state enforcement, like we saw under Henry and Elizabeth, in the setting of, with all the informers and the priest hunters and the rest, that she enforced, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I enforced the creation of a state church. We didn't have that. We somehow twisted our way past those two problems and to create American exceptionalism. And how did we do it? I think we did it by having rival Protestant denominations that somehow, even in their theological differences, contributed to the central current.
Yeah, I had just a simple question. After identifying the spiritual anxiety as a problem that that we're seeing,
Right.
What are your thoughts then about what is to be done?
Someone was talking today, who was doing work on this, some of this similar stuff, about being just a reporter, a historian of this. It's really tempting for me to say, oh, look, I'm just the observer, I'm just reporting this. What do I actually think? Well, I think if we all converted to Catholicism, and, I'm a Catholic, so I'm sort of required to say that. But I think short of that, I don't know about this, what's happened in this last election, right? I don't know the extent to which there really has been, there's some visible signs, right? But I don't know the extent to which they really mark a turn against DEI stuff and some of the identity politics and some of the woke stuff, or at least a kind of saying, okay, far enough. We're not going to reverse it, but we're not going to keep going down that road. I've read people who claim, that it's done. Wokeism is done. It's a failed political project. I've read people who said, every time you make big changes, there's a reaction against it, but once the reaction is kind of petered out, we just keep advancing, and that this is the shape of ideas of cultural, let me not say cultural, sociopolitics, the sociopolitical path, that we're just, we're in a temporary holding or even reversal, but it's going to keep going. I've read people who think that. I don't know what the answer is, but I would explore, if I were to make this, I would explore the idea that there are ways in which we can turn the temperature down, that we can see if there are ways in which we can offer horizons for the spiritually motivated. I do think there is a God-shaped hole in us that will not be satisfied, and that let loose from its natural places where it might seek some kind of satisfaction causes nothing but anxiety. As I said, not everybody is going to feel, in fact, a majority of people are going to be perfectly happy without, or at least feel themselves happy, without any numinous, sense of the numinous presence. But the ones who are anxious, who feel that anxiety, are really dangerous people. And this is, Ronald Knox has a beautiful book called Enthusiasm, in which he looks at enthusiastic religion and fears it, fears what it can produce. But he thinks the solution to enthusiasm is a kind of calm acceptance, a wry acceptance, a kind of grown-up acceptance that the social order is never going to satisfy us. You just have to look to yourself, participate in public life, but stop thinking that public life is the be-all and end-all of things, which is kind of what we had with American Protestantism before this. That, it wasn't government, it wasn't the political order that shaped our lives. It was about salvation of the self, and the churches had far more influence in creating who we are. They defined our families, they defined our marriages, they baptized our children, they buried our dead. They gave us the forms by which all that happened, and that was real life. And you could go through life without caring about politics. And, were there downsides to that? Absolutely. That's how we let segregation go on for so long. There are downsides to this, but it would be meaningless and false to say there weren't also upsides to it. One is a calmer political order.
So I want to end with a question. I wonder if what you're calling the awakening or identity politics is sort of just an appendage on sort of inverting the construction of your subtitle, that spiritual anxiety will remain, right?
Because it's human.
Well, and I think that whether we get rid of identity politics, whether that is the solution to what ails us, there is still something that ails us, and it seems like having defeated identity politics, we will still, The Atlantic had a recent article about college students that don't or can't finish reading books. Jonathan Haidt has his whole thing about.
She quoted one professor, or the author quoted one professor, and she said she noticed that her students lacked the attention span to read a sonnet. They couldn't trace through the argument of 14 lines of pentameter, and that's how bad it is. I will say.
I'll give you the last word, but I think that identity politics, no identity politics, it strikes me there's something deeper in that.
Right.
So you can say the last thing.
And absolutely. I opened with these ideas that we need to relate human nature to the particularities of the social situations we find ourselves in. One of the ideas, I mentioned René Girard's kind of point there, and this Weberian claim, Max Weber claim about spiritual anxiety. There's always going to be spiritual anxiety, right? You can get better and worse situations for it to play itself out, but it's human, which means it's always going to be a threat and present in some ways. And I will say, in answer to your question, I anticipated it unconsciously, I think, by mentioning Reinhold Niebuhr and the idea that the great mistake is to think you're going to solve things once and for all, right? We can make things better, but there is no stable solution to the human condition. There is no stable theopolitics that ends discourse, that ends anxiety, that ends agitation. It always, something happens because we have free will. And that means the clash of interests is always going to roil us. We will never escape it. We never reach final solutions. We only reach the solution for now.
And we're done. Yeah. Thank you.